we've decided we have a hashtag for this. Great to spread the rumor. Even people who can't get into the recording or session could at least, for example, get a copy of the book. That's sort of unlimited. And so please use your social media if you like it. And if you don't like it and you got criticism, you can use social media for that. Let's see. Okay, anyway, OSWA, Oslo Software Architecture Meetup, and Systems Enterprise Architecture or Systems Engineering Architecture. That will be our hashtag going forward. Yeah, so if you want to take a quick photo of the QR, easy way to get the book. Otherwise, you can photograph the screen and use this link, tiny URL. That'll be there for a long time. And if you want to communicate with me, let's see, thought I had this in here, but tom@gilb.com. I think that's also in my Zoom thing, but and I had quite a few people who sent me a mail, and I sent out quite a lot of stuff to people, like about technical debt and about medical systems in Norwegian and things like that. I think I answered everybody by the time the evening was done. So I hope you enjoyed that. And so the rule is we're going to run for an hour, and I've got an alarm set at 5 o'clock. Then the main lecture will be done, if not before. And we will do questions until a maximum of 5:30 or whenever we're done with questions. And then after that, people are very welcome to email me. And while I'm watching television and having dinner this evening, I'll be happy to answer your queries or even actually talk with you on the phone if that helps or anything like that. So our subject is systems, meaning not just IT. So we can use this for IT systems, but even IT systems have to take a systems approach that is considering people and culture and old systems and and laws and everything. So even a narrow IT architecture has to really take a systems level approach. I write the word enterprise because we use the term enterprise architecture. And what I have is, if you like, a new generation of enterprise architecture, which is different from the other ones because it is far more engineering bent, that is far more quantification, far more logic, and really is based on an engineering discipline which I've developed. Here's the syllabus. So today we're going to do value-driven architecture, chapter 1. We've already done the introduction. And then every Tuesday and Thursday, we're going to do these things until we've done chapter 9. So you can read ahead, you can read backward, and you can review what we've done by looking at the chapter. There's more detail here we haven't quite figured out. Important to note for newbies, we have a glossary, which is a subset of a 700 concept glossary I have, but it's a subset for this book. So if you want to look up terms, what do I mean by architecture or enterprise or anything, you have a glossary at the end of the book. And then we have a lot of references, which is a whole lot of free books and papers and things like that. So, no end to the reading you can do if you want to. I'm writing the book in anger at the enterprise architecture I've seen, which I don't think is good enough for the very large scale, complex things we have even in a little country like Norway. So enough of that. Now, I'm going to start with 1.0. I'm using the book as effectively slides. And so you can follow it. I don't have any other separate slides. And I did go through this a little bit as a preview last time. So we have 3 main principles, and I'm a fanatic on deriving basic principles for anything and everything we do. So you'll see you'll find throughout the book, I have like principles for prioritization and principles for decomposition. And it's a nice way of summarizing what we're talking about and teaching and maybe remembering what it's all about. So let's do the first three principles. First, I have a concept called stakeholders, which we'll go through in more depth. Now, many of you are, of course, interested in concepts like the user, as in use cases, user stories, user design, UX, and customers, very important sources of requirements and understanding why we're doing the system. In large-scale systems engineering, i.e. Defense and space, you'll find that for decades, they've had a culture of what they call stakeholders. Now, stakeholders include all the users, all the customers, and about 50 other kinds of stakeholders, like the laws of the European Union. Okay, so stakeholders, another term for stakeholders is sources of requirements. And in fact, I have another term, critical stakeholders. Critical stakeholders are, as the term implies, able to manage life and death of your system. Okay, so critical things, medical things in your body, they determine life and death, like your heart's beating, your brain is functioning. And so critical stakeholders means they have the power to shut you down or never let you start up, such as the Norwegian government deciding that EU laws, so there are two stakeholders, the government and the EU and the law, were not good enough for the Smittestopp app for COVID tracing. Those were stakeholders that were in fact forgotten or not prioritized highly enough. And so we wasted quite a few months getting an app that was legal according to our government. Okay, so stakeholders determine their own values. In other words, what they value, what they want, what they need, the improvements they want. And this can be absolutely anything. And many values are also what we call qualities. So they might have a value to have higher security, higher user friendliness, higher transparency or privacy and things like that. Those would be qualities. But some values like reducing the costs are not what we call qualities. But values are simply anything the stakeholders decide subjectively, maybe even wrongly, that they want. Okay, and if they want it and you don't give it to them, they're not going to be happy, and they may not pay, they may not use the system. They may even badmouth it or choose a competitor. So you ignore stakeholder values at your peril. Okay, now there are some stakeholders that are not critical. And in other words, they don't have the power to shut you down or help you succeed. They're just out there. And we could prioritize and say, we need to do the critical stakeholders first for survival. Then we can take a look at the non-critical stakeholders and be nice people and help them too, if we have the energy or resources. So in a sense, you want to map all the stakeholders. I'm going to go into depth on that in a moment. But you do need to annotate which ones are clearly critical to your survival. And then you need to determine their values. And any one stakeholder can have one or more values. They can't have zero values, because then they wouldn't be a stakeholder by definition. But stakeholders can have any arbitrarily large number of values. In practice, a given stakeholder might have from 1 to 10 values or something like that. We never really go up to 100 or anything like that. Now, these values can be expressed as requirements. Okay, and I sometimes, instead of using the term stakeholder, I use the term requirements sources. So we're actually into an area which we sometimes call business analysis. Okay, We analyze who are our stakeholders, and we analyze what are their values. And then the values we decide we will deal with in our system, we write them down as requirements. Okay, so requirements are our way of saying we acknowledge the value, we're going to try and deliver it. We're going to need an architecture to deliver it. Okay, so this is a process. Here's the word architecture in principle number 2. So we're not at architecture, we're pre-architecture. And I believe that there are 2 faults with conventional architecture. One is that we don't go deeply enough into the stakeholders. We're too caught up in the users and even assuming that everything is a user story or epic and from our agile culture and assuming that's the truth. And I think we absolutely need to look more broadly at our stakeholders, or we will fail and waste our time. We will get the wrong architecture. So this is a necessity that you look into your own corporate processes and say, do we have a stakeholder analysis process, and is it good enough? That's one thing I want you to sort of learn today. I think most people have a bad conscience there. They're not really doing it. If anybody out there says we have a fantastically mature and impressive stakeholder analysis process, I'd love to hear from you, get a copy of it, and discuss it with you. Okay, so just email that to me. But normally, let's just say in enterprise architecture and IT in Norway, I have seen practically no impressive, interesting stakeholder processes, and we've got to change that. The other thing is, I see the term value-driven architecture. So what I'm saying is our architecture needs to be primarily driven by the need to deliver the critical values that the critical stakeholders want. So our focus shifts from we're going to make some architecture to we're going to make sufficient architecture to deliver a set of values that critical stakeholders have. And these values are expressed for our projects in a thing we call requirements. There's another problem, and that is the requirements are not well enough formulated. They're often what I call management bullshit level, like we're going to have big, and this is pervasive, and 99% of everything is really silly. But you know, we're going to have high security and good transparency, a lot of julebordsfraser, Christmas speeches, ambiguous terms. So we're going to talk about getting the requirements clear enough for good architecture. Okay? I believe that invariably we have, and I see it all the time, everywhere, for many years, very few exceptions, we have very poor requirements practices, and these are the input. These are, we are as architects, we are totally dependent on good, clear requirements. So moving along, we'll get into detail about all this stuff, but moving along, the second principle is that value requirements determine the necessary architecture. In other words, how do you know if you've got the right architecture? How can we quality control or review or argue for and against any architectural idea? And the answer is with reference to how well the architecture satisfies the value requirements. Okay, the job of architecture is to satisfy the value requirements. Got it? Now notice that's plural. It doesn't say the value requirement like how well it satisfies security or flexibility. You have to simultaneously with your architecture satisfy a large number. The number starts at about 10 and maybe goes up to 50 if you want a little bit more clarity there. A large number of value requirements have to be satisfied simultaneously with the architecture. Now, I see time and time again, as late as yesterday with a European client of mine, that people have what I call one-on-one thinking. We're going to do encryption to get security. Take a simple example. Now, so encryption is some kind of architecture, and security is some kind of value, both badly defined, of course. Now, this is called one-on-one thinking. You know, that encryption only seems to relate to security. Security only relates to encryption. And as I'm going to be opening up for today, the fact is we have multiple requirements that simultaneously have to look at multiple sub-architectures. Okay, many to many, not one to one. And that's a very, unfortunately, very prevalent habit, that the architecture is sometimes determined just with relationship to one value. And in fact, as I'm going to point out in depth, we have to, whether we like it or not, because in the real world, any architecture will impact, for better or worse, many value requirements at the same time. That's nature, that's life. You can't vote it away or oversimplify it away. But anyway, the main point with this principle is that in order to have any sane discussion about any architecture, we have to ask the question, what are the official, accepted, set, plural S, of value requirements that architecture has the job of satisfying? That's the only purpose of architecture, is to satisfy. Satisfy means if I want my security levels to get twice as good, I have to have an architecture that leads me to twice as good security. Okay, that's satisfying, for example, the security requirement. So there's a requirement level that I have to satisfy, or in fact, as we'll see, requirement levels, there's a plurality of levels, but we'll tackle that when we get there. Okay, so in other words, please reorient yourself. The architecture is merely a tool, merely a means for satisfying the value requirements of the stakeholders. And we have to, in a sense, decide which stakeholders we're going to respect and deal with. That's a subjective decision from us. If we make a wrong decision, we may have a failed project, but we're going to look at all possible stakeholders and pick initially the critical ones, and then maybe some less critical ones if we've got the resources. And we're going to try to figure out their values, even though they are unclear about their values, and just say high security. And we're going to turn them into requirements which are quantified and clear, crystal clear, so we can measure and we can reason about the architecture, and we can measure when the architecture is partly or fully deployed, whether we are satisfying the requirements. This is the engineering part, quantified requirements and quantified architecture we're talking about. Finally, there's a concept called costs and constraints, which we're going to deal with today. Now, costs are people, money, time, sometimes even storage space. They are resources that we are consuming with our architecture. Okay, so all architecture has costs, very rarely zero cost everywhere. And we don't have infinite resources. We don't have infinite money, infinite time, and infinite people, and infinite storage space. So at some point, we're going to have selected so much architecture that we've blown our budget. We've breached our deadline. We don't have any more people. And then we don't have the ability to pull in any more architecture, even though we need more architecture to satisfy our value requirements. Long story short, the architecture has to deal with budgets and projected consumption of budgets and actual consumption of budgets. And I don't think our architecture methods are very good at that. Some architecture methods, it is completely absent from consideration to deal with costs and budgets, like doesn't count. That's ridiculous on large systems. Even little Norway has 22 billion kroner medical systems targeted, and that is a non-trivial amount of money. And we've got an 8-year projected project time after having spent 8 years in this. This is Axon I'm talking about, if anybody wonders. 8 years preliminary studies. So we have non-trivial time, 16 years, non-trivial costs, billions, and not to mention the number of people involved, which would probably be hundreds. So because we have even a small country and one system in one area, health, has a huge costs, we have to have an architectural method that manages these costs better. By the way, there's an engineering paradigm called design to cost. Look it up. Okay, and what it says is you don't manage costs by estimating it will cost 22 billion kroner in 8 years. What you do is say we would like it only to cost 1 million kroner and take 1 year. Let's design it or architect it so it will only take 1 million kroner and 1 year. By the way, if you want to know how to do that, the key word is North Macedonia and Australia have already done it, and it's well documented. So just buy the system from them like North Macedonia did. Okay, so in other words, so this is a powerful way of managing costs and deadlines, is that the architect finds cheaper, faster ways of doing it and specifies them as the architecture. This is really an amazing idea, and too few people seem to have the idea. They just say, how are we going to do it to satisfy all the requirements? And I wonder how much that will cost and how many years it will cost. That is a stupid method of managing resources, and Norway at least should stop doing it instantaneously. We got better things to do with our taxpayers' money, oil money, and time. So, so in other words, the costs and costs determine possible architecture. Okay, that means if we have a low budget and a nearby deadline, like 1 million kroner and 1 year, then we have to pick architecture. Okay, we determine which architecture we can deliver within 1 year for 1 million kroner, like the North Macedonia Axon one patient, one record system. Okay. In addition, the costs will determine the priority of implementation of the various architectural ideas. And in general, the lowest cost things with the highest values, we will prioritize first. It'd be kind of silly to take the lowest value and the highest cost first and blow your entire budget on a minor value. That would be illogical. So I'm going to discuss in detail here prioritization, where we are going to prioritize implementation of architecture incrementally, agile, in other words, but based on the value to cost. Okay, that's the prioritization mechanism. So that means we have to quantify the values and quantify the costs so that we can prioritize intelligently and deliver good value for money to our sponsors. Okay, so costs. Now, I haven't talked about constraints. So constraints are things like it has to be built in the European Union, or it must be in agreement with European Union privacy policy, GDPR. Okay, or it must use Norwegian contractors if possible, rather than foreign contractors, because we have a little problem getting everybody employed. Okay, so those are constraints. Now, again, I think the architectural methods I've seen are not very good at dealing with constraints at all. We need to establish what they are, establish how powerful and accepted they are, write them down, and then every time we pick a new architectural idea, we have to pass the constraints. It says, does it violate any of the constraints? If yes, we have a problem. Sometimes the problem is solved by modifying the constraint. Constraints are not absolute, they're just extremely useful. Okay, but sometimes we have to reject the architecture, especially if we can find an equally good architecture in terms of costs and values, which does not violate the constraint. Then that's the choice of the architect. Of course, you know, we're not going to move the constraints just because we can't think of a second architecture for getting there. Okay, so that's the powerful principle. This is, if you like, a summary of today, but costs and constraints decide for us, help us decide the possible architecture. I say possible because we need to have a hypothesis about what good architecture is, but we need to validate that hypothesis by implementing, let's say, on a trial basis or a small increment, some of the architecture, and we need to measure, this is agile, as it should be with feedback. We need to measure whether we're getting the values we thought we would get at the costs we thought we would get, with not violating the constraints we thought we would not violate, okay? So in other words, all initial architecture is just a possibility, which a hypothesis in scientific terms, which needs to be validated by actual implementation and measurement. Again, that's the engineering and also the scientific principle coming in, that an architect can't just say, we're going to do this architecture, that's the end of that, no matter what it costs and how bad it is. All architecture is subject to measurably and meeting the requirements reasonably, and the cost levels reasonably, and the constraints reasonably. Ooh, that's a lot there, but we're going to go into more detail. Okay. Now, I went through a little bit of, let's see, I'm going to get rid of a whole bunch of things on my screen that don't want to deal with. Calendars. Okay. Okay, 1.1. We've used half an hour on one. Okay. I was afraid I'd have too little to say. Now I'm afraid I have too much to say, but what the heck. And I did preview this last time, but I'm going to do it more probably. Okay, so here's this stakeholder concept. And I hope everybody's thinking, has my enterprise architecture method taught me to deal with stakeholders? Do they use the term stakeholders? Okay, or do we just have users and customers? Okay, if you're not dealing with stakeholders explicitly, you do not have a mature, capable of dealing with large architectural systems. And again, if you're only doing 2 weeks of coding for a friend of yours, you don't need these concepts, but you do need them if you're going to do a Smith-to-Stop app or an Axon health system. Okay, because these are systems affecting millions of people and millions of kroner and things like that. So the larger and more complex this system is, the more you're going to have to adopt stakeholders as your norm. By the way, the moment you're seriously talking about architecture at all, you probably always should be talking about stakeholders. Okay, architecture is, again, something that doesn't come in with simple systems crafted by a programmer in 2 weeks, but they come in when you have larger, long-term complex systems. So I can't imagine any form of enterprise architecture that should not arguably deal with stakeholders, and I leave it to you to think about that. Now here's some text about it, but I like the diagram here. So here's what I can call a checklist or template for stakeholders, to give you some idea. And so here we have types, basic types of stakeholders. Now here we have the obvious. Here's a stakeholder: the CEO, the chief financial officer, the chief technical officer, the founder of the company. So these are usually individual single people who may have a lot of influence. For example, particularly in a startup, the founder is a very important stakeholder. And then as it matures, your chief technical officer may be a very important stakeholder too. So, but these are typically individual stakeholders, and there's any number of these. This is just a sample for all possible projects in Norway forever. There may be a list of 100 different kinds of types of individuals. They're interesting, for example, a nurse or a surgeon or somebody like that. Now, we then have group. In other words, stakeholders that are a multiplicity of people, like the board of directors, contractors, employees, managers, project managers, steering committees, trade unions, things like these. So, so again, this list is just illustrative. It'll get you thinking, but it's not exhaustive. I believe everybody in their own environment, let's say you're in the health environment, should make a pretty good list of stakeholders for your health environment and build on it every time you learn about new critical stakeholders like GDPR, which Smittestopp had to learn about, and the European Union, and add to the list. So you have a better checklist for the next project, even though you've screwed up the first project royally by forgetting that stakeholder. So you should have a stakeholder list for our culture. And you should be learning about those stakeholders, their power, their needs, what typically are their needs and things like that, what experiences you have with them, and keep track of it electronically in a database. Okay, so do you have a database of typical stakeholders and knowledge about their needs and experiences? If not, you're not as mature as you might be one day. Now, most definitions of stakeholders, like IEEE definitions, which I've cited in some of my book, Competitive Engineering. There's a free link to free copy of a digital version of Competitive Engineering. But if you look up there under stakeholder, oh dear, there we go. You'll find an IEEE definition, and it seems to only acknowledge that stakeholders are flesh and blood human beings, which corresponds to what we have in the individual and the group. And a long time ago, I realized that some stakeholders are not flesh and blood biological things. They're things, fairly early, I realized they are inanimate things. And here's a list of inanimate things like agreements, architecture, contracts, council regulations, culture, international law, national law, standards. Okay, so these are typically written things that people have written and people will read, but they're not flesh and blood living human beings that have opinions, and you can't say to them, what do you feel like today and what do you choose? You have to analyze them, but and analyze them looking for their requirements, like a privacy requirement from an international law called GDPR. So, so it's important that we recognize which inanimate things do we have to have respect for, and what are the typical requirements that might hit us from any one of these. We have to learn what they are and store the corporate learning and reuse the learning and add to the learning when we get a bad experience because we forgot something. Okay. Now, as time went on, and I'm actually working towards writing a book on stakeholders. Please encourage me this summer. I'm trying to develop the theory of stakeholders beyond what you'll find in other literature. And we began to discover we had an interesting category called weak victims. Okay, and here's a list: handicapped, jobless, we've got plenty of those these days with COVID, sick, plenty of those, thank you very much. And and the list can be longer, but weak victims don't have a lot of power, not directly. They don't have a lot of money typically. So it's very easy to listen to those in power with money, right? But sometimes our job, especially if we're government, is to listen to the weak victims. That's the job. And listen to their needs, even if they don't have a big voice and a lot of money and the power to shut you down as a government. But it's got to recognize they are our stakeholders, and their needs are exactly what were put in place to deliver. So there's a very interesting extension to the idea: who are the weak victims in your system that have needs that you're going to have to architect towards, okay? And then we discovered that there's a category of people called defenders of weak victims: charities, councils, courts, governments, media, pro bono lawyers, United Nations. Again, an illustrative list in both cases, not an extensive list, but it makes you think, who are our defenders of weak victims? And they may not be customers, but they have needs so that they can help your system defend the weak victims. And we've got to analyze What are their needs, and how can our architecture satisfy the defenders of weak victims so the defenders of weak victims can satisfy the weak victims? By the way, if anybody's especially interested in this area, I wrote a book 2 years ago. You'll find a free download of it in the references called Sustainability Planning. And it's an analysis of the United Nations sustainability goals, which all the Norwegian government ministers have a little badge on them saying, we believe in United Nations sustainability goals. Okay, and what I found is the United Nations sustainability goals are very poorly defined, point where they're mainly United Nations bullshit rather than clear objectives for architecture of important things like reducing hunger, increasing education, and other rather important things like that. So go get, if you can't find it, send me an email, but sustainability planning. I also have some lectures on that subject, which I can share with people. And those are hopefully probably in the references. Okay, so that's stakeholders. Now, here's another map. This is from a student exercise of the kind we've held for many years. We've held a 2-day workshop course at OSWA, which we're prevented from doing for the moment, unless we figure out how to do a workshop course on the internet. But so this is actually a 5-day version we did in Poland, and they chose as a project changing Polish law, culture, and government and universities so as to spread knowledge more effectively. Very nice. Norway should maybe consider doing the same thing. You know, not to say let's have a better university, but how do we effectively spread knowledge, for example, to people who've already been to university, who need to be updated in the new technologies like the ones I'm talking about here. Anyway, so day 1 of the course, I said, make a list of your stakeholders. And so here, in fact, are the various stakeholders. It's a team of maybe a total of 10 people, maybe more, who came up with various stakeholders. Okay. Then I said, take one really important stakeholder and come up with a value they have. So here, the little yellow arrows is a set of values they came up with that these stakeholders have. Okay. By the way, these values are, as we shall see, quantified and detailed, and to make them very clear, very measurable, and very useful. We'll look at that in more detail. But okay. Now, by the way, when we found a value, which becomes a requirement in our system for a given stakeholder, we made a note electronically, digitally, that you know, this requirement was connected to this stakeholder. Okay. So now, as we gradually build up more and more stakeholder information, that is a constant learning process. It's not a one-time, one-day process. And as we build up more and more values, again, which is actually a constant forever for the lifetime of the system process to acknowledge new values, new levels of values, the constant improvement of the system for its lifetime, we ask questions like, okay, initially this was connected to this stakeholder because we looked at the stakeholder and said, what are your values? And we said it's, you know, acquire new library resources. But then at some point we asked another question, are there any other stakeholders who like that value? Now, for the moment at this point, the answer was no, there are no other stakeholders. But in some cases, for example, we can take this one down here, technical learning. You'll see, I need a lot of green lines. Okay, here it is. More political power is a value. And here, obviously, about 3 or 4 lines going to various stakeholders, okay? By the way, we can select and make this all more visible, but right now I just see that we have established that more political power is a value held by multiple stakeholders. Now that's interesting. By the way, that gives that value, and pun or joke intended, more political power, because several stakeholders are interested in it. But the thing is, they might not be interested in exactly the same types of power or the same levels of power at the same time. So you might actually have 4 different requirements about political power for the 4 different stakeholders. Can you absorb that thought? What I'm primarily trying to show is we can and should map relationships, and mapping them digitally is a very good idea because it's the only practical way to keep track of them as the system evolves through time. Now, by the way, as we move, see these little yellow light bulbs? That's a symbol for a given architectural idea or strategy. There are names of them here, but I've cut them out of the diagram. So any, so we get a clean line here, but any given, here we have radical religious doctrine. You got quite a few lines going up to various things. What that means is there are several types of architecture, different architectural ideas that serve this one value, that are necessary architectures for achieving the level of radical religious doctrine value that people want to get. So what you can see here very roughly is that at some stage we've said, okay, for one of the values, come up with the architecture. And they have indeed on the workshop. We've done this in Oslo for about 7 years. Some of you will have been on the OSWA courses where we do it. And people are asked to come up with, sometimes we just call them design ideas, sometimes they're architecture ideas. Usually the top level of design we call architecture, and then as we decompose it to more and more detail, we begin to use the term a design or sub-architecture or something like that. But long story short, when we find suitable or potential or hypothetical architecture for reaching a goal, we make an electronic note in the app. And this is an app called Valplan, by the way. And we can then automatically draw and keep up-to-date diagrams which show the relationship between our architecture and any set of values. And then in addition, we can take a look at any set of values and see which stakeholders stand behind them. We might need, as time goes on, to ask stakeholders, have you got any new values or different levels of values or any changes in your situation that require us to have improved requirements? And thus, because we've changed, the moment you change the requirement, you potentially require better architecture or design. Okay, so what I'm trying to do with this fellow here is to show you the idea of keeping track of complex architecture and its relationship to all the requirements and the requirements relationship to all the stakeholders. Okay, so indirectly via the requirement, we can relate stakeholders to architecture, since you follow the line down there and then lines up here, and suddenly you can see how if you want to discuss an architecture very seriously, you could invite to maybe an electronic meeting representatives of the stakeholder to say, we've discovered that this architecture is incredibly expensive. We've got a cheaper architecture. What do you think? Okay, so that's a way of bringing the stakeholders into the conversation, but you have to know who to ask, and so you have to have a traceability of the stakeholders, and even have to know the, if you like, the email and telephone number and people who volunteered to talk to you and represent, say, the nurses at Ullevål Hospital or something like that. Okay, moving along, values of stakeholders. Okay, now the moment I say the word value, I think almost everybody naturally thinks of financial value. Okay, but I'm not really talking about that. I'm largely talking about non-financial values. Okay, but I could be talking about financial values. Okay, but I'm largely talking about non-financial values. Okay, such as security, such as transparency, such as user friendliness. Now, a lot of these values we call qualities. So I have a definition of quality. It's how well the function is done, how well it does security, how well it does transparency, how well it does user friendliness, how well it does adaptability. So there's a whole bunch of qualities, many of which are standard in almost any system. Almost any large system needs to think about security and privacy and user friendliness today. So they're like, you can expect those values to pop up, and you have to establish what do we want there and feed that to the architect so they can find appropriate architecture for those qualities. And then in addition, there are values which are not qualities, like earn a lot of money is not a quality, but it is a value. And so our total set of values is qualities and non-qualities, one way of thinking about it. Okay, but all of these have in common that one or more stakeholders value them. That means want them. That means we can choose or not choose to write them down as a requirement. Okay, the moment there's a requirement for us, we've chosen a stakeholder value to work towards. Okay, there could be lots of values and qualities that we choose not to deal with because they're out of scope. There could be lots of stakeholders we choose not to deal with because they're not critical enough for us. We can't cover every stakeholder and every value in any project at any cost. Okay, so this is a matter of prioritization. Which stakeholders are we prioritizing now? And which values of the stakeholders are we prioritizing? And then, as we shall see, there's even which level or degree of the values are we prioritizing. The stakeholders might dream of incredibly fantastic 99.99999999999% availability, but maybe that would cost $5,000 billion and they can't afford it. Okay, so you can't just give stakeholders, however critical, everything they dream about. We have to find an architecture that will satisfy it, and if there's no architecture, we can't do it. Okay, for example, I have a value. I want to go to the moon and back in 5 seconds. Well, there's no architecture for that. Sorry. Well, I want it, and I'm powerful, and I'm me. Sorry, there's no architecture, right? So if there's no architecture, in other words, it's outside the state of the art, they can want it all they want it, and they can be as powerful as they want to be and rich as they want to be, and you still can't satisfy them. Okay, so there are limits to what the architect can do, and the architect needs to feed that back and say, I hear you, you want 99.9999999% availability, and I understand that would be very nice. The fact is, there is no known architecture for getting there. So you can't have it. They say, oh, then I'll go to another architect. You say, go to another architect, but come back to me when you want somebody who will tell you the truth, Mr. Trump, about what's real. Anyway, now we're gonna, if you look at part 10 of the book, that's actually where we go into detail how to specify quantified values. So we'll get to that sooner or later, more or less. But I have a special way of quantifying all the values and clarifying them. And you could look ahead to part 10.1 of the book to see the planning language or planguage for quantifying the values. In other words, for telling us what do the stakeholders want. And some of this may be unrealistic, and the architect will be the first line of defense that says, you're not going to get it because I can't figure out an architecture. And they might say, I'll find myself a better architect. You say, do that. And if by the way, you do find an architecture, tell me, I'd like to know, but I don't know and I can't help you. So, Tom Guild. Let's see, we've got 9 minutes left. I'm not sure why I'm getting little feedback messages saying Tom Guild is talking, but it's still okay. Okay, 1.2, the values. Okay, now here's a formal definition in my language, my planning language glossary, which you'll find access to in the back. But value is perceived benefit. A message from my son Kai that SpaceX Starship launch coming up. We'll look at that. Okay, so now perceived benefit means that's what the stakeholders think they're going to get. You know, they're going to get so and so much availability and so much security. Okay, and they want it. Okay. So, so that's the benefit we think we will get from initially the architecture and later the actual implementation of the architecture in the real systems. They'll get it from the system which contains the architecture. And here's some more detail on the concept of value. But basically, I've tried to take a dictionary definition of value. So I'm not inventing anything weird. But I found that value is like the #1 concept for all projects and for all architects. That's where you've got to start. The job of the architect is to find architecture that delivers value. Okay. Let's see. Don't know if I want to deal with that. I've only got 7 more minutes and it's about time to go into costs and resources. Okay, so let's see. Let me do it this way, because if I could get through this by 5 o'clock, that'd be fantastic. So I'm gonna skipping a page of text. I'm just going to show you an illustration, but let me introduce this, which will be a friend of ours throughout. So we're at 1.3, costs and resources. Okay. And let me introduce to you a thing I call an impact estimation table. There's the name. You'll find this all over all of my literature. And it's a kissing cousin of what is known as quality function deployment, QFD. If you know about that, that comes from Toyota and Lean and things like that. And on this axis of the table, we have architecture 1, architecture 2. In other words, we have various kinds of architecture. This is simply the tag or the name of the architecture, which is detailed somewhere. But in a sense, this table is now evaluating 5 different architectures. These could be alternative architectures. I'm going to either do this architecture or that architecture or that architecture, or they could be a set of architectures where ultimately, I might need to do all 5 of these to reach my goals. I don't know yet, but they are all architectural hypotheses. That is, I think they look good, and now I need to make some decisions about them. Now, on this axis, I have actually above this axis, I have a lot of values, and and I'm not going to show them yet. We'll get into that. But, and I've looked at these architectures from the point of view of how much value do they give. And I've put some numbers on what degree of value they give me. We won't get into that yet. But, and I found that they all satisfactorily give me enough value. In other words, they'll do a job or do the job. What I'm focusing on here is the idea of costs and constraints. So we have the following kinds of costs. We have the capital cost, in other words, the budget for building the whole system, which seems to be £3.5 million. We have the calendar cost, how many days until it's delivered. Here is 1,000 days or 3 years. And we have the number of warm bodies we're going to need, the full-time equivalents. Says here 200,000, very large project. And we have we're also looking ahead to when the system is operation, and we're looking at the maintenance costs. Okay. And what we're saying is every architecture will cost you some money. It'll cause you to use a certain quantity of days. It will cause you to need a certain number of warm bodies, and it will somehow impact your maintenance costs. Okay. And what we'd like to do, in other words, we're going to look at 4 different dimensions of costs. And the moment you have a budget, you actually have a constraint level. In other words, your constraint is this budget, 3.5 million pounds. And your constraint is about 3 years. Okay. So, but these are limited resources. And we're expressing the idea of a constraint by having what is conventionally known as a budget or a deadline or something like that. And what we're saying is each architectural idea needs to be evaluated numerically by, forget all these numbers here. There's too much detail to go into. We've only got 3 more minutes. But the bottom line is this architecture will take 14% of our budget. Okay, not bad. This architecture, it says question mark, means we haven't evaluated, maybe we have difficulty doing it at all, so we don't know what it'll cost, so it is a known unknown. And it might cost 3 times the budget, in which case it's a no-no architecture, right? But we know we don't know it, so it's too early to reject architecture 2 and too early to accept it, okay? This architecture will take 100% of our calendar time. In other words, it's going to take us 3 years. Oh, now, if we can do the other architectures in parallel, we can do the other architectures too. But if it consumes all of our manpower, but it only consumes 8% of our manpower, then we can't do this in parallel. So begin to see the problems. Okay, so notice we're actually summing that up. So if we were to do all of these architectures, forgetting the fact we have an unknown here, and it's not really 0, we would use 52% more than the number of days in our project. And if we were to do all the architectures, forgetting the fact for the moment that we have an unknown, which is probably not 0, we'd use 21% more than our budget, the sum of all these, etc. We can begin to look at how it sums up if we were to do everything. By the way, green here means that it's within safety margin bounds, so we're okay. And red means we've exceeded the safety margin, and we have a problem, Houston, with the full-time equivalents. We just simply don't have enough manpower to do all of these things. By the way, by using the percentages of our budgets, etc., we can actually add up the percentages, and I've reached my limit, so I'll begin to wind down. We can actually develop a number for the overall resource usage number, magic number, 122.25. So we can see that, for example, this design uses about 5 times more resource than this design. And if they were otherwise equal in the values, then certainly I'd choose this design. In fact, we've already done that. We've looked at the values, which are invisible in this chart for the moment, and the costs. And green here means that the value to cost ratio for this particular architectural idea is 10, which is 4 times better than the value cost ratio for this one, and 2 times better than the value cost ratio for this one, and about 5 times better. So in other words, here's your winner in terms of which if you can only choose one architecture, maybe this is your baby, or if you only choose one architecture to start with and see if it really is as good as our theory and hypothetical estimates say it is, then you would start with this architecture, because even if it disappoints you in terms of values and disappoints you in terms of real costs, you're still likely to come out better than if you start with these too costly not too good value architectures. So long story short, and I have to begin to stop this, or we'll continue this story. You might start like to think about it, is that we can use an impact estimation table to look at our costs and resources, as well as our values. We haven't done that yet, but we're into costs and resources here. The multiple costs and resources of our architecture, and to begin to make decisions of prioritization, like which one is the winner or which one is the one we should do initially. And there's some more here, but there is no more time. So here, by the way, is a table with the values. And I think I'll need to start there next time or something like that. This is actually from the United Nations stuff, I believe, like ending poverty. But here we're using the same table to look at the degree of values delivered to the requirements on such a table. And we'll talk more about that later. We're going to be talking next week, Tuesday, about architecture efficiency, which is actually the sum of all the values over the sum of all the costs. So there's a new interesting concept: how efficient, what is the cost effectiveness, what is the profitability of your architectural decisions. And generally speaking, if you're asking your managers, should we do cost effective architecture or just forget it and not even bother to look at the costs, I hope you'd get a good answer like, of course, you should be looking at the cost effectiveness of your architecture. And of course, you should be designing to the ideal deadline and the ideal budget. You should be finding architecture that takes little time to implement and gives little cost, like the North Macedonian Australian Axon systems, instead of the stupid stuff coffered up by the PwC people in Norway for the Axon systems. I'm being very blunt, right? What the heck? Nobody can fire me. I'm a pensioner. Okay, I will stop there. In fact, I'll stop there with a sort of a picture on the impact estimation table for next week. Sorry, this is even this week, and I didn't get there yet, but an hour is an hour and time to start talking. And so we're going into question and answer time. And let's see, I'm going to get a picture of all you nice people. And there we go. So who would like to ask the first question? And it's very nice for me if you turn on your screen and I can see you, but you're not obliged to do it, especially if you're naked or something like that.
Hi, Tom. Fantastic. This is Nick.
Hello, Nick. Where are you, Nick? Where are you located?
Actually, I'm in the UK.
I thought so, but could have been Australia or something like that. Have we met before in any context, Nick?
I'm with GfK at the moment. We haven't met as such, but you.
Right. One of my clients.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, I'm very glad somebody from my client is going to attend these seminars. Later, you'll start paying me for the same lecture. But it's
probably.
Yeah, it's free now. Okay. Yes, Nick. What would you like to ask?
I've got a couple of questions, but I'll do one and then somebody else can go. So earlier on, I think in the first 10 minutes when you were talking about the stakeholder analysis process, I just wondered, what to you do you think a good stakeholder analysis process looks like? What are the
Okay, I'll give you a simple answer. Now, first, I don't think you should start from scratch if you can avoid it every time. That's ridiculous. Because for example, you're a company, no matter what you're doing, where you are, you tend to have roughly the same set of stakeholders, and they tend to have roughly the same set of values, just roughly, right? So there's every reason to build a database of known types and even specific instances of stakeholders, like a given customer, right? And in a sense, keep track of the history of what they said they needed, what they actually needed, if they sued you ever. I mean, really, somebody needs to have a stakeholder database for a large corporation like yours. And you're international, you have 8,000 people. So any project should start with the GFK database of known stakeholders, which every project is required to keep up to date and put new inputs into and new remarks, right? So the process, a mature process in any organization that talks about architecture, is there is a stakeholder database and it is up to date and it gives you 95% of what you need for your project right away. And it remembers things that you otherwise would forget. Therefore, your project would become a failure, even though other people in your organization have learned the hard lesson, it is forgotten, right? That's a pretty good answer. And then the answer is no such database will give you all the stakeholders. There are constantly new stakeholders that pop up, and old stakeholders have new needs, right? So there has to be a business analyst who goes out there and says, okay, here's my first draft of stakeholders based on our stakeholder database, but I've done, it's clear to me we have actually we're attacking a totally new type of customer, so they have to get in here. And that new type of customer, I have to talk with them and ferret out their needs and values, and I have to put that in the database as well as in our project. Now that's a short answer, and I promise you, sort of promise, I'm gonna write a whole book on stakeholders this summer.
I figured that.
Remind me by September, send me an email. Have you written your stakeholder book yet, Tom? And can I have a free copy? But it's on my agenda, and I write 5 new books every summer. Okay, is that a pretty good starting answer for you, Nick?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much.
Okay, pleasure. Again, happy to talk about it in grandiose detail. In fact, the work I'm going to do for you will probably get into that in practice.
Good. Excellent.
Next person would like to ask a question. Oh, and Nick, feel free to email me anything you'd like to follow up on.
Will do.
Especially as you are my paying client. But I give free answers to people that attend this one.
It's a question about, I was looking, I've been attending your other workshops earlier on, a few years ago. And to me, there is a kind of a balance between how much time you're going to use on all those analytics parts before you start delivering stuff as well. So you want to expand on that? This part, when you said you have a database, so stakeholders kind of the answer for
I got your
part
question,
of it.
I can answer it. Is it Jon Leierdahl, or what's your first name?
Yeah, it's
I remember. Not bad.
I emailed you on Tuesday. Yeah.
Okay, now time. Okay, now I already gave you a hint on the workshop courses of 5 days that we do. By the way, we don't do them in Norway, and we don't. The longest one we've ever done with OSWA is 2 days. So we actually squeeze it in. We squeeze the stakeholder analysis into the first half of the first day. Okay, we use a half a day on stakeholder analysis. Now, the very large chart I showed you from Poland, we used a whole day. So that very large stakeholder chart was made in 1 day by about 10 or 15 people brainstorming. Okay, now if you already have, now they did it from scratch. Now, if you already have a stakeholder database, that gets 95% of the work done for you instantly at no cost. So it's only the marginal cost of saying who are our new stakeholders and their new needs, and you should certainly be able to do that in 1 day. So, so in other words, let's keep it real simple. I'm not talking about using more than 1 day initially to get a stakeholder map out there. And I'm not talking about more than 1 day getting the requirements out there, the top 10. Okay, that's what we used in practice on real projects for real clients and on the courses. Okay, so now, by the way, that doesn't mean you're done with stakeholders or you're done with requirements, because it is actually, as you get feedback and learning, it's an eternal process for the life of the system and the life of the organization, right? But you don't have to get it all right on the first day, and using 6 months to do stakeholders wouldn't get it all right anyway, okay? So what we need to do is get a pretty good start, Okay, and if you on the first day get 50 stakeholders, you have a much better start than your immature process, which only thinks there are users out there, right? Much better start. So it's all about, we're always open-ended. This is agile, my stuff, agile, my stuff. We're always open-ended for getting feedback and learning about new stakeholder needs. Okay, now if you go to the books and references, you should find something about a method I call the Project Startup Week. And I have some papers on it.
I think I've seen that, yeah, yes.
Yeah, you'll find it, you look in the references, Project Startup Week. Now, this is how for 40 years, I have started all my real projects using this. By the way, Nick, it's what we're going to do with you, already approved by your CTO, Ben, right? I start all projects, no matter how big. In other words, the Axon project in Norway, I would do in 1 week. And what do? Same thing we do on the OSWA 2-day courses, but we use about a week to do it. Day 1, we do the stakeholders and the requirements. And the output is 1 page of the top 10 critical requirements quantified. And we always achieve that in 1 day, no matter what. And if you don't know how to do that, well, that's what I'm going to be teaching on this course. Okay? Doesn't matter how big the project is. For any project, no matter how big, like to take the Axon Health project in Norway, there are 10 really critical objectives. And it'd be a miracle if you ever delivered them in practice, because most such projects have terrible failure rates. Okay? And you identify those top 10 on the first day. On the second day, we do the architecture. What's that? The output of the second day is the top 10 most powerful architectural ideas you can imagine, like using the North Macedonian system you can buy for 1 million kroner. Okay? And you lay that on the table. Okay? And you do that on the second day. And you have another alternative, the PwC alternative for 8 years and 22 billion kroner. Okay? You lay that on the table. And you have some options, but you do the entire top 10 architectural ideas in 1 day, time constrained, on 1 page. And what do you do on Wednesday? You do the impact estimation table. You put your top 10 architectural ideas across the top, your top 10 values you did on Monday on the vertical alignment, and you spend the whole day giving rough estimates of how good is the North Macedonian and the PwC system for delivering the health values for Norway. And you take a look and say, well, actually, the North Macedonian system and the DREAM system, PwC, they're equally good. There's just one difference. The North Macedonian system can be done in 3 months for $1 million, and the PwC alternative takes at least 8 years for 22 billion. I think we'll dump the PwC guys. Goodbye, PwC. Hello, North Macedonia and Australia. That decision of the right architecture is made on Wednesday. Notice that PwC used 8 years and 20 billion kroner to come up with the wrong answer for the government. Now, the governments realize that, so they're sort of saying, this is looking ridiculously expensive, and it looks like PwC is going to get all the work. And there's some, it's actually some illegal, unethical things going on there that is public. Everybody knows about it now, including the government. So I'm not blowing any whistles here. But to find out that essentially the same project working in a country of our size called North Macedonia, they have 2.5 million people, I think, roughly, for $1 million already done. It's just amazing that we have such bad ways of looking at how to do systems in Norway. We must be very rich with oil money to waste all that money. And we don't care about killing our citizens with bad systems either, because we're willing to use at least 16 years to get a bad system running. And I'll be dead by then, and I don't like that. Okay, now what do we do on Thursday of this startup week? Okay, and the answer is we ask one simple question. what sub-architecture could we do next sprint? Now, sprint, usually a week, could be a month, could be a quarter, could even be a year for a 20-year project. But what one thing could we do in practice to get some results in the actual health system that exists today? Okay. So we don't say build a new system. We say we have an awful old system. That's why we're thinking of a new system. What can we do to improve some of those values with some of that architecture in the short term and prove that it really works? This is a complete pivot. I normally find that you do not build new systems from scratch. They always fail. History is very clear. Look it up, failed IT projects on the internet, okay? What you need to do is incrementally take your old system, warts and all, ridiculously bad, stupid things, and start improving it using architectural ideas step by step. And after you've done 20 to 50 steps, the new system, as you dreamt about, will emerge. And you'll swap some hardware and software along the way, but that won't be the essential idea. You're looking for things that you can implement in the short term that give results in the short term. Well, I'm still alive. I'm 80 years old. I'm not interested in PwC's 18-year system to save my life in Norwegian hospitals, right? I want it this year. I want it before the vaccine gets put in my arm. It's not there yet, right? Okay. And I am a stakeholder and I am a taxpayer. Okay. So in other words, Thursday, you ask this incredibly simple question. This is an agile. We're going agile. What sprint can we do that will deliver some of the value that the nurses and doctors and FHI and Health Directorate and EHS want? Now, it turns out initially, everybody's in denial. There's nothing you can do. You have to build a 22 billion kroner system for 8 years. PwC said so. And by the way, you have to use them to build it, in case you didn't know. Now, okay. Now, it turns out if you push people hard enough, like tell you what, if you can find a way of achieving some of those goals in 1 week, I will give you personally 1 million kroner tax-free. You know what? Somebody's going to have an idea to get that 1 million kroner reward. In fact, what we always find is there always are several things you can do next week and every week to advance the agenda, to move ahead and deliver value. And you're just not asking the right people, the right questions with the right motivation. Okay, the motivation of the PwCs of the world is to start a project that goes on forever, blood sucking the Norwegian government for money forever with a project that never ends. History is our witness. I'm not exaggerating at all. Look at our NAV projects, for example, okay? So we got to get smart here, and getting smart is getting agile. And what we need to do is say that it is not illegal or irrational to modify existing systems in the short term so that they work better. And you ask the doctors and nurses, would they like to have, for example, 10 times faster COVID tracing next month, okay? Or wait 8 years to get it. They probably want it next month, okay? And they say, but we'll have to use the old system that you're complaining about. And they say, so what? We're talking about an improvement of the old system. That's exactly what I want. I don't want you to build a new IT system for 8 years. You know, we'll all be dead. Okay, that's enough of that. I'm on my high horse here. Jon, question sort of answered. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you what we do on Friday. We go to the big boss, right? The Mr. Høie from the Health Directorate, and we say, we have found out some fantastic thing we can do next week to modify, speed up the COVID tracing, right? Would you like us to see if we can do it, or do you want us to use 8 years to figure out how to do it? And Mr. Høie will say, next week, please. Maybe you're crazy But if you can do it, I want to find out. And I want to find out next week. We're working on a week-to-week basis here. We're working on a day-to-day basis here. We need results now. We do not need PwC to build a 22 billion kroner IT system. Thank you very much. I just fired Christina because she had these ideas. Berglund. She'll probably claim she didn't get fired. Good riddance. Okay, Jon, is that enough for you?
Yes, this, and then I always figured agile part was a big deal of it. But I like that project started. I remember you heard about it earlier, but I had to have gotten that part a little bit. It happens. That's
okay. By the way,
thank you.
Your microphone is a little bit shaky, so I'm not clearly hearing all your words. Just your feedback.
But thank you. That's the main part.
Okay, fine. Next question. We have 8 more minutes or so.
So Tom,
yes.
I have a question related to prioritization of values. So yes. Different critical stakeholders would have different values.
Yes.
So those values would not be comparable across stakeholders, or they would not be comparable to each other. How would we prioritize them against? Every critical stakeholders would say that his value is the most important.
Okay. Now, by the way, I have a whole section on prioritization coming up. You'll find it. I have actually written a 60-page book, which is free and referenced, called About Prioritization in my value planning book. There's probably a link to it. So I have a lot to say about prioritization, which I obviously can't say in 5 minutes, but we'll cover it. But I'll give you an outline. Now, one of the reasons for understanding stakeholders more deeply is to understand their power. And power is a function of things like legal power, political power, respect power, people respect them, money, ability to bribe the politicians. Okay, so you can say any given stakeholder has a set of powers, and you can analyze these. Okay, and long story short, the stakeholders with the most power will tend to have the most priority for their value. That's the short answer. You have to analyze the power dimensions. And I've gone deep into this. If somebody says, show me your deep analysis of power of stakeholder, I've got some stuff never published on it, which I'll put into my new book. But it's as simple as using your common sense. How do we identify the power of the Prime Minister, the Parliament, the EU, a nurse, right? The union, and so there's multi-dimensional powers they have, right? And long story short, their set of powers will in practice, if you're rational, determine the priority you have to give to what they value, no matter what the other stakeholders want. And if you don't do that, they will use their power to find alternatives to you and your system. It's that simple. They will go where they get their values satisfied with their power. And your system will be a failure. The North Macedonia system will be used instead of the PwC system for Axon. That's my short answer, Jagan. Jagan, where are you residing, just so curious?
I'm from India.
India. Are you in India right now?
Yes.
Where in India are you?
New Delhi. Capital.
New Delhi, okay. Been there. I even been to the Red Fort that's been attacked recently. And I've done a lot of work in India. We can talk about that sometime. Actually, my claim to fame there is I once helped Tata Consultancy Services start up their whole business. And my contribution was to tell them that if they wanted to sell their services internationally, they had to consider quality. And they decided that was correct, and they did it with a vengeance. And that's how I changed the whole economy of India, personally.
Thank you.
I'm not joking. You can ask FC Kohli, who started it, if he knows Tom Gill or not.
So Tom, relating to Jagan's question there, on page 10, where you've got the values and the qualities in the arrow, and the point of the arrow is the quality. underneath that, you say that some other values are not qualities.
Yes.
What's the difference between the values and the qualities? Are the qualities the things that you...
Now, first, it's really a matter of a subjective but useful definition. So if you look at the back, remember my concepts are defined at the end of the C book, right? So you can look up value and quality and things like that. Now, but let me remind you, so quality, I've taken a fairly conventional look at it. A simple way, we're talking about what are called ilities: reliability, availability, maintainability, but security. And okay, but I've analyzed qualities very deeply. It's my big specialty, and they are how well the function functions. Okay, now stakeholders value those qualities in general. So they're always part of the set of things we call values. So all qualities are valued sometimes by some stakeholders. Now, but it turns out there are values that are not how well, they're how much. Like how much money will I earn is a value of some stakeholders, but it is not a quality. Okay, so the set of things called values are qualities and non-qualities that are valued by stakeholders. That's the short answer. Good enough for the moment? Look up the definitions.
Yeah, thank you.
This is arbitrary but useful. I mean, from the point of view of the architect, who cares? They're all values I have to find architecture for. Next question. Hi, Tesfaye. Nice to meet you again. We had some correspondence about health systems. I've offered to help Tesfaye and FHI if they want help doing these things. I'm ready when you are, Tesfaye. Later this evening if you want to start working. But I've sent him all my Norwegian, what I've done is I've translated the Norwegian Health Service objectives from vague and crappy to quantified and clear in Norwegian, and I've sent Tesfaye and 2 other people who asked a copy of my work there, so that you can see how it's done.
Thank you very much. I have been busy the last 2 days. I didn't get time, to read, the slides that you sent me.
No hurry, no hurry.
But I will get in touch with you.
Just do it before I die in a Norwegian hospital. That's my priority. Next question. Don't be shy. And you know the option, you can see my email in my picture. And so anybody says they're too shy or they think of a question afterwards, just email it. I will give you answers, but I might give you something to read, because normally I've either written a paper, a book, or set of slides, or done an audio course on everything you're going to ask me. So I'll just feed you those. But and if you want to talk and you say, I've got something important like the survival of the Norwegian race, I'll help you. I'm a Norwegian citizen as well, but I'm also an immigrant, Tesfaye. I wasn't born here. I arrived in Norway at 17 years old and decided it was a nice place to stay.
Yeah, it is, I like, being here. Even me, I'm an immigrant from Ethiopia.
I know.
I came to Norway, in 2002.
Right. And I came in 1958 and stayed. It's a good place to be, but it can get better with its IT systems and health systems. We're good, but we can move towards perfection. Now we've reached the end of the question and answer. So I'll say going once, going twice, last questions. Gone. Okay, so we'll quit there and you can close down, Sharice, if you want.
Yeah, thanks. No, thanks for the presentation. It was good. It was a good. Both of these days we've got quite a good discussion afterwards. Often it's very difficult to get people to talk, but I think this format also works much better with having everybody in Zoom. Yep. Instead of running on YouTube with just questions in chat.
Yeah.
So it's much better.
Norwegians are notoriously shy about asking questions. That's why we got questions from a Brit, an Indian, and an Ethiopian. That's okay. Norwegian, you can email me.
One Norwegian asked a question.
Yes, yeah, but I didn't mention him because he was the exception. We found that about half of all the people that attended my courses at OSWA are not native Norwegians. So that's why we went over to English.
Yeah. It's great for this for us at also software architecture to now get people from England and India listening in. You know,
the international community gets to know about our little Norwegian group.
So it's some benefit from the COVID crisis.
Yes. I'm loving COVID. I'm meeting so many interesting people all over the world that I never did before, even though I traveled extensively internationally. So it's weird, but it's easy to access people anywhere for an hour suddenly. Never was.
Yeah, I've started attending the London microservices meetup. I think that's really good, that one.
Aha.
So that one I would never have a chance to.
You might like
otherwise.
to put a link to that so people know about the English microservices thing. So lots of people are interested.
Yeah, I can put it in.
Okay, bye-bye. See you
thanks,
on Tuesday at 4 o'clock or by the video. Okay.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Lots of fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Excellent.
Sitter där och kosar där för hej.
Let's see.